Start. Okay. So
Okay.
welcome everybody to today's Zoom meeting, a seminar on irritable bowel syndrome. It is going to be spoken about by Dr. Sri Balaji on etiology and pathophysiology, and the diagnosis and treatment by Dr. Govind. So let us begin with Dr. Sri Balaji. On to you, doctor.
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. Let us have a very short talk on the pathophysiology of irritable bowel syndrome. Irritable bowel syndrome is a functional disorder characterized by long-standing, relapsing abdomen pain associated with changes in bowel habits. The changes in bowel habits are mainly attributed to changes in the stool consistency and frequency, despite the very real symptom which a patient are having. The endoscopic and microscopic findings are absolutely normal. Basically, irritable bowel syndrome is a functional manifestation of stress in GIT. It is usually a diagnosis of exclusion. It is diagnosed based on symptomatology alone. There is no pathologic or imaging or any other findings constituting to its diagnosis. Coming to the pathophysiology, the pathophysiology of IBS is yet to be understood. Traditionally, the gut-brain dysregulation is told to be the main abnormal thing here. It is the disordered communication between gut and the central nervous system, leading to motility disturbances in the intestine and visceral hypersensitivity, leading to increased pain perception and altered CNS processing of the information from the GIT. Other less correlated hypotheses include genetic associations, alteration in the gut microbiota, and then disturbances in the mucosal functions and the permeability. Coming to the altered motility factor, IBS, there are two subtypes based on the clinical symptoms, which will be discussed by Dr. Govind sir. It is mainly divided into diarrhea subtype and the constipation subtype. IBS-B, that is diarrhea subtype, may result from high amplitude propagated intestinal contractions, or it may be due to increased gastrocolic reflexes or rectal hypersensitivity. Some autonomic abnormalities like sympathetic adrenergic dysfunction may also be there. The constipation subtype may result from increased segmental non-propulsive contractions, or it may be due to decreased high amplitude propagated intestinal contractions, or it may be due to reduced rectal sensations. And autonomic dysfunctions like vagal dysfunction may also be there. Visceral hypersensitivity, the main symptom of irritable bowel syndrome is abdomen pain. This visceral hypersensitivity contributes to the increased perception of abdomen pain. These IBS patients are more aware of intestinal contractions and gas after meals or stress. They are mainly due to abnormal sensitization within the dorsal horn of the spinal cord, mediated by serotonin, some neurokinins, or calcitonin gene-related peptide or nitric oxide. There is increased transient receptor potential vanilloid 1 at the rectosigmoid junction. Also, there is recruitment of more silent nociceptors at the intestine level. They all lead to increased perception of pain by these patients. The main factor is the CNS dysregulation and other psychological factors. The CNS dysregulation in irritable bowel syndrome is strongly suggested because of its high correlation with coexisting psychological conditions like anxiety and depression. Comparing to the normal population, physical and emotional stress level is high in IBS patients. The gut CNS actions is bidirectional. Mostly GI symptoms develop in patients who are already with these psychological symptoms. Sometimes initially these GI symptoms develop following the psychological symptoms. Stress increases the intestinal secretion and the permeability. Stress hyperactivates the intestinal immunity via this human necrosis factor alpha. Also, the functional CNS imaging in IBS patients shows hyperactivation of the mid-cingulate cortex and the frontal lobe. This mid-cingulate cortex is responsible for attention and response selection, and this frontal lobe has the vigilant network for alertness. This area hyperactivation leads to increased perception of visceral pain. This is the table which shows the CNS death pathway. Uh, Environmental factors like stress and abuse causes an alteration in gut epithelium and the gut microbiota, which leads to changes in the tight junction and increased intestinal permeability. They lead to altered interaction between the host immune system and the microbiota, leading to increased localized inflammation and edema, which cause infiltration of the inflammatory cells and release of cytokines. They cause changes in the visceral neuromuscular function and the development of the IBS symptoms. Next, coming to the mucosal inflammation. Normally, our intestine is in the state of low-grade controlled inflammation due to interaction between the host immune system and the commensal enteric organisms. In IBS, there is an increased level of inflammatory cytokines in the colonic mucosa and elevated mast cell counts near the entry neurons and the B cell lymphocytosis. Serine they increase the epithelial gaps, resulting in increased visceral permeability, leading to altered host and commensal interaction, leading to a vicious cycle. Interferon gamma releases the serotonin. Interferon gamma decreases the serotonin reuptake, leading to IBS diarrhea subtype. There is a subtype of irritable bowel syndrome known as post-infectious irritable bowel syndrome. It mostly affects the young females. The persons who are acutely infected with the Campylobacter, Salmonella, Shigella, or who are long-standingly colonized with spirochetes develop irritable bowel syndrome later in their life. The development of irritable bowel syndrome in this infection depend upon their long-standing duration, toxicity of the strain, smoking, female sex, depression, hypochondriasis, any stressor in the past 90 days, and antibiotic administration to the initial gastroenteritis episode. Age more than 60 is a negative risk factor against IBS. And another factor contributing to IBS is altered gut microbiota. There is no solid evidence correlating to this alteration in gut microbiota, but we have found culture in the stool culture of the IBS patients showed decreased bifidobacterium and lactobacillus and increased Firmicutes species. And dietary factors are found to be contributing to irritable bowel syndrome. Patients with the lactose intolerance and fructose orbital malabsorptions and may develop IBS in their later life. It is due to these disaccharides, which are not absorbed, get fermented in the intestine. They cause flatulence and osmotic diarrhea. Secondly, fermentable oligomonosaccharides and polyols, shortly known as FODMAPs, are seen in some exotic fruits, also contribute to osmotic diarrhea and flatulence. Also, abnormal bile acid metabolism is found to have some correlation between irritable bowel syndrome. Lastly, coming to the genetic factors, except for the SCN5A mutation, there is no other genetic factor which is strongly correlating to the irritable bowel syndrome. Genetic factors are suspected in IBS because IBS tends to aggregate within families and it is seen in more in concordance within the siblings. This SCN5A mutation is the one which is also responsible for the congenital QT prolongation syndrome. Recent studies have found that this SCN5A mutation is also seen in patients with IBS. This is the gut CNS axis. The localized inflammation, first the patients will be normal. They will be having initial infection and inflammation and of the gastrointestinal system. They won't be having any psychological stress or factors. It causes changes in the tight junction and intestinal permeability and alterations in the gut microbiota, which causes localize the infiltration of the inflammatory cells and changes in immunocyte function and cytokine release. They in turn systemically go and affect the central nervous system, causing anxiety and depression secondary to these GIT symptoms. These peripheral factors like food, acute gastrointestinal infection, mucosal inflammation, abdomen or pelvic surgery, and menstruation are seen in majority of the patients, but they contribute to very mild symptoms of the IBS. But these central factors like stress, somatization, anxiety or depression, poor social support and maladaptation and abuse contribute to severe symptoms of IBS. So it is found that central factors contribute to more of IBS, and this is the diagram depicting all the risk factors and all the hypotheses relating to IBS. It shows in the central nervous system acute stressors may be there. Traumatic life experiences in the past may also contribute to the uh, irritable bowel syndrome. Also, localized factors like antibiotic administration, gastrointestinal infection, any diet and food intolerance may contribute to irritable bowel syndrome. Uh, there are there is also a genetic component which leads to irritable bowel syndrome, like some mutation, altered gastrointestinal immune system, increased intestinal permeability, and the mucosal inflammation. Thank you.
Thank you, doctor, for elaborating on the pathophysiology of irritable bowel syndrome.
Okay.
Thank you. We go on to the next speaker, Dr. Govind, who is going to tell us about the investigative methods, the diagnostic tests, in which is also going to dwell something about the clinical manifestations and finally the treatment. Over to Dr. Govind.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you, ma'am. Thank you, Dr. Balaji. So I'll be discussing the diagnosis and management of IBS. As Dr. Balaji has already discussed, the pathophysiology of IBS still remains an enigma, and because of that, the treatment also remains mostly symptomatic. Not going to the details of this, it's mainly more common in young adult women, and estimated global prevalence is around 5 to 10%. That is based on different Rome criteria, although the Rome 4 criteria has not yet been fully validated by data. Currently, we are following the Rome 4 criteria that was established in 2016, according to which the mandatory criteria is that the patient should have an abdominal pain at least once a day per week in the previous 3 months, with the symptom onset more than 6 months before the diagnosis is being made. Along with this abdominal pain, there should be 2 out of 3 of pain related to defecation, change in form of stool, or change in the frequency of stool. And once a patient fits this criteria, we have to look for red flag signs, which we'll be discussing. And in the absence of red flag signs, we can classify the patient as IBS, and further subtyping of IBS is to be done as per Bristol stool form chart. So this is the same criteria. I just want to bring the notice to the red flag signs we were talking about. This is a criteria that once a patient fits this criteria, then you have, the next thing is to look for the red flag signs, which include age more than 50 years, recent change in bowel habits, overt GI bleeding in form of melena or hematochezia, nocturnal symptoms, unintentional weight loss, family history of colorectal cancer or IBD, palpable abdominal mass or lymphadenopathy, evidence of iron deficiency anemia, or a positive fecal occult blood would point towards a more organic pathology than towards a functional disorder like IBS. So this should be ruled out in the first place. in order to classify the patient as IBS. If the patient is not having any of these red flag signs, then we can proceed to subtype the patients based on Bristol stool chart, according to which if the patient is having more than 25% of the stools are hard lumpy stools and less than 25% are loose watery, then we can classify them as constipation predominant IBS. And if it is more than 25% are loose watery stools and less than 25% are hard stools, then that can be classified as diarrhea predominant IBS. If it doesn't fit either of these category and they are having both hard lumpy stools more than 25% and loose watery stools more than 25%, then they can be classified as mixed IBS. Coming to the diagnosis, so it's mostly affect women aged 20 to 40, although it is very variable. And most of the studies, in fact, has been done on elderly population, that is more than 45-year population. Most of the study has been done just to show that IBS is not limited to this particular age group. Abdominal pain is a mandatory feature and it is usually recurrent lower abdominal pain, intermittent and associated with defecation. As I already mentioned, ROM4 is a new criteria which has not yet been validated by data, and most of the data that we have is based on ROM3, and the sensitivity and specificity of ROM3 is around 68.8 and 79.5 respectively. But if we put other symptoms also into ROM3, then we will be able to increase the sensitivity and specificity. Like, for example, the bloating and distension and concomitant psychological disturbances like anxiety, depression, chronic fatigue, or the absence of nocturnal stools can actually increase the sensitivity and specificity of the ROM criteria. Since there is no accepted biomarker that has been found till now, we cannot make a definitive diagnosis based on a biomarker. But in spite of all this, it is advised to make a positive diagnosis of IBS rather than to resort to extensive investigation to rule out organic pathologies. Because many studies have been done in which IBS has been diagnosed and subsequently extensive investigations has been done to find out that there is no organic pathology associated with it. So as of now, the current diagnostic approach is to positively diagnose IBS based on symptomatology and absence of red flag signs, and based on a basic level of investigation rather than go for extensive investigation to rule out every organic pathology and to make IBS as a diagnosis of exclusion. It's not supposed to be made as the diagnosis of exclusion. So this would be the diagnostic algorithm. Anybody presenting with symptoms that is consistent with the ROM4 criteria, after evaluating for the red flag signs, if it is not there, then the basic laboratory testing can be done based on CBC, C-reactive protein, fecal calprotectin, and celiac disease serology, because these are major diseases which can be ruled out based on simple blood tests. After, if they are all negative, then a diagnosis can be made directly without doing an extensive investigation like colonoscopy. But if any of this comes as abnormal, then you are supposed to go for a more extensive investigation to rule out other organic pathology. After making an IBS diagnosis, then based on the Bristol stool chart, you can subtype the IBS. The differential diagnosis of IBS, basically the constipation predominant IBS doesn't have many differentials except pelvic floor dyssynergia, in which the patient is not able to pass the stool, or the patient is having excessive straining. There will be history of excessive straining, or there will be incomplete evacuation, or the history of anal digitation is there. Then a pelvic floor dyssynergia can be suspected and can be confirmed with the DRE, digital rectal examination, and the anorectal manometry. But the differentials for IBS that is diarrhea predominant has a extensive differential diagnosis, including most importantly IBD and celiac disease. Celiac disease can be ruled out based on the fecal calprotectin, celiac serology, and IBD can be ruled out based on fecal calprotectin. Other than these two major ones, others are including small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, in which case there will be a history of gastric and intestinal surgeries, or bile acid diarrhea, in which case actually CHECAT scan and FGF19 levels can be done, but most of it's not available. So a trial of bile acid sequestrants is better than going with a more extensive and expensive investigations. Colorectal cancer can be diagnosed based on the red flag signs that we have already discussed. One another diagnosis that can be done, and in fact it was found in most of the patients who had been diagnosed as IBS based on ROM3, and subsequently colonoscopy was done, and in whom this one particular diagnosis was made for many of them, was microscopic colitis. The pointing factors towards microscopic colitis is that there will be older women who have variable abdominal pain, and the duration is very short, considerable to IBS, and there is usually a coexistent autoimmune disorder, and they will have symptoms that is inconsistent with IBS, like weight loss, nocturnal diarrhea, and the use of drugs like NSAIDs and PPIs. Coming to the management, there is, as I already mentioned, there is no, the pathophysiology itself is not very clear. So the management is basically symptomatic management towards addressing the symptoms that the IBS presents with. So, and none of the treatments that has been evaluated so far has been shown to alter the natural course of IBS. Long-term efficacy of the treatment is not known, because most of the treatments that has even shown efficacy is only being conducted as an RCT for 12 weeks at the most. The management basically includes, first of all, lifestyle, diet, and probiotics. Second is the pharmacological first-line treatment and pharmacological second-line treatment, which are there, which we'll be discussing. Before going into management, the color coding that I've used, the yellow colors represent those trials in which the efficacy is efficacy is there, but the trial quality, data quality is poor. And the green ones have good data quality and has been proved to be effective also. Physical activity, increased dietary fiber, especially isfigula powder, has been found to be effective more than bran. Bran has been associated with the exacerbation of symptoms. Some patients can identify trigger foods which can trigger their symptoms, including, as Dr. Balaji has discussed, FODMAPs, and sometimes even gluten-containing diets can also trigger IBS, and caffeine and alcohol. Low FODMAP and low gluten diet, which has been recommended for a long time, is under scrutiny now, because the long-term restriction of low FODMAP and gluten is something that is yet to be identified, because it is said that if you restrict FODMAP and gluten for a long period, then that itself can cause a difference in the microbial environment of the gut and precipitate the symptom. Probiotics, again doubtful. Efficacy has been proved in some studies, but still doubtful, because what constitutes the microbial signature in an IBS patient is yet to be identified. And so we cannot treat it with a species unless we know what species is causing it. Coming to the first line pharmacological therapies, it's, as I already mentioned, it's mainly directed at the predominant symptom that the patient is presenting with. Either it is diarrhea or it is constipation. If the patient and pain is the common feature that both the patients will present with. Again, the long-term efficacy is not known. And most of the first-line agents have been evaluated previously, so the data quality is poor, and the methodology and the selection of patients for these studies is very poor. So commenting on their efficacy, although effective, but to what extent we cannot say, based on newer studies are not done on these older agents. One agent, that is peppermint oil, has been found to be very effective and has a very good trial data to support its use. Other than that, laxative can be used in constipation predominant IBS, and antidiarrheals like loperamide can be used in a constipation predominant IBS. Antispasmodics forms the core of the treatment because the patient's main symptom itself is the pain. Without pain, there is no IBS. Pain is a mandatory feature that has to be there, and that can be relieved with antispasmodics like simetropium, phenylnephrine, hyoscine, or otilonium. Coming to second-line pharmacological therapy, these agents have been better studied than the first-line agents, and you will see that there is more green in these slides than the previous ones because they have better trial data and better efficacy has been proved with these agents. First of all is antidepressants like TCAs, which both has a neuromodulatory action which changes the way of pain perception by the brain and also slows the GI transit and can be used in IBS diarrhea predominant. SSRIs also has been investigated, but their efficacy is very doubtful. But TCAs have been done in patients who have been selected heterogeneously. That is, both diarrhea patients, no subtypes were specified for any of the trials that has been done with TCA. So one particular heterogeneous patient selection is there. So the data quality regarding the subtyping of patients is very poor in these patients, in this category of drugs. Pregabalin also has been used and has been found to be useful in patients who are who have complaints regarding to the pain associated with IBS. Regarding second-line pharmacological therapies that can be used for IBS, that is constipation predominant, you can use 5-HT4 agonists like tegaserod has been used. The trials has been done very extensively and it accelerates the GI transit. There is a slightly increased cardiovascular risk and is preferred only in younger patients. Intestinal secretagogues like linaclotide, lubiprostone, plecanatide, and tenapanor can also be used. They are basically acts on ion channels, which increases the water efflux through the luminal side of the intestine and increases the GI transit, again useful for IBS, constipation predominant IBS. As far as diarrhea predominant IBS, there are other agents like 5-HT3 antagonists like ondansetron, alosetron, ramosetron, which slows the GI transit and reduces visceral hypersensitivity. Other than that, there is eluxidolin, which is an opioid receptor partial agonist antagonist, which slows the GI transit and reduces hypersensitivity. Rifaximin also has been used based on the theory that there is a difference in the microbiome of the patients who are suffering from IBS and has been found to be effective. Coming to psychological therapies, most of these patients do have psychological disturbances in form of depression, anxiety, or somatization. At some point, either preceding the IBS or even afterwards, after developing IBS, they might have psychological disturbances, and hence psychological therapy has been found to be very effective. And in the phase that we don't have anything to relieve the pain in IBS is still a problem that has to be dealt with, and it is adequately dealt with through psychological methods which can alter the perception of pain by the brain. And cognitive behavioral therapy, gut-directed hypnotherapy, relaxation therapy, and dynamic psychotherapy has been used. This has been found to be useful even in drug refractory cases, but the psychological therapies, the main drawback is that the RCTs based on psychological therapies are prone for bias and the reliability is poor. And in a country like India, the problem of availability of trained personnel. These are some of the future prospects and ongoing studies based. on treating IBS. That is, we still don't have a biomarker to point out in case of IBS, and we need to better understand the pathology in order to treat it rather than treating it symptomatically. So our approach is now to move from a symptomatic approach to a more individualized treatment based on the patient's own own pathophysiology. Other pharmacological therapy right now under investigations include for constipation SGLT1 inhibitors like mesagliflozin, DRA inhibitors like DRA inhibitors are there. Their names are just under trial. Elobixibat is a bile acid transporter inhibitor, which can be used for constipation, predominant IBS, and diarrhea predominant IBS, farnesenoid X receptor and agonists like obeticholic acid and topifexor and has been used. Pain predominant IBS, we have oliceridin, which is an opioid receptor ligand that is being investigated, and cannabinoid receptor agonist like olorinumab has been investigated. H1 receptor antagonist, that is Avastin, reduces visceral hypersensitivity, which contributes to the pain. This is basically the picture showing all the drugs that I have mentioned so far. The first line therapy still remains for diarrhea, loperamide and antispasmodics, for the pain, antispasmodics and peppermint oil, and for constipation, laxatives and soluble fibers. As second line therapies, you can use TCAs, 5-HT3 antagonists and rifaximin and minoxidil for diarrhea, H1 receptor antagonist, oliceridin and olorinumab for pain. And as far as constipation is concerned, mesagliflozin, eloxacibat, and DRA inhibitors are still under trial. These are all drugs under trial. The second line agents have already completed trial, and hopefully they'll be coming in the first line therapy in the coming years. In conclusion, I would like to say that there is no definitive biomarker. In the absence of that biomarker for IBS, and IBS has to be diagnosed based on symptom alone, and a positive diagnostic approach has to be maintained because to avoid unnecessary extensive expensive investigations. Better understanding of the pathophysiology in the recent years has led to more novel modes of treatment that could be employed and but still the treatment of IBS is still remaining symptomatic, and future research into these pharmacological and psychological approaches will yield more results. Despite all this, the main symptom of IBS, that is a pain in IBS, still remains. There's a dearth of medications or treatment options when it comes to treatment of the abdominal pain. That is a main symptom of IBS, where only psychotherapy and central neuromodulators have been found to be effective. Considering all this, even with the treatment, only 20 to 30% of the patients are relieved of their symptoms despite treatment. So patient education regarding the disease and the limitation of the existing treatment modalities is essential to the management of IBS. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Govind, for your detailed deliberation on diagnostic dilemmas and differential diagnosis and management of IBS. Thank you, Doctor. Now to add on to a few points, irritable bowel syndrome is also known by a couple of other layman's terms called spastic colon and nervous colon. And I think Dr. Sri Balaji mentioned it as a diagnosis of exclusion. Though it was initially a diagnosis of exclusion, currently it is actually a diagnosis of inclusion of certain symptomatology based on this Rome's criteria. Now this Rome's criteria you have been telling, any idea what you mean by that, Doctor? Dr. Govind? Can you hear me?
Yes, ma'am.
Dr. Govind, you have been mentioning the Rome's criteria. Can you tell what is this Rome's criteria? Where does this name come from, Rome? Actually,
Sorry,
it is
ma'am, I don't know.
yeah, please tell me.
Yeah, I
Actually,
don't
it
know,
is
ma'am.
yeah, please.
No, ma'am, I don't know.
Okay, fine. This Rome actually is an independent non-profit organization, international organization, which deals with research. Now, a number of gastrointestinal disorders have been researched in association with this foundation, and IBS is one of them. So it is one of the what you call FGIDS, functional gastrointestinal disorders, or we can also call it as DGBI, disorder of gut-brain interaction. Now, Rome criteria was started in 1992, and you have criteria 1, criteria 2, criteria 3, and criteria 4. Criteria 4 is the latest. Now, the difference between criteria 3 and criteria 4 is because of the abdominal pain, which you said is the main important symptom which is present. Now, this chronic abdominal pain was given a diagnostic frequency of 3 days per month as per criteria 3. Now, Rome's criteria 4 has increased the frequency that for the diagnosis of IBS, the chronic abdominal pain can be present even 1 day in a week, not necessarily 3 days in a month, even 1 day in a week, it can be present for it to be included for the purpose of diagnosis. So that is the difference between criteria 3 and criteria 4. And the types that you said, Dr. Sri Balaji told that there is a IBS-C, which is to do with the constipation variety, IBS-D, which is to do with the diarrheal variety, and the third one is IBS-M, which is mixed variety. There is also a fourth one in contemplation, which is IBS-A, which is the alternating variety. A little difference between the mixed and the alternating is, in the mixed is during one particular group of symptoms, they will have diarrhea and constipation almost alternating with each other on this on a day-to-day basis. Whereas in the alternating variety, they will have the diarrhea and symptoms alternating over a period of time instead of just days. So that is the difference. So you have the fourth variety called the alternating variety. And this gut-brain axis, when you mean gut-brain axis, can you elaborate on that?
Ma'am, usually the gut-brain axis, it is a physiological term which is given for the harmonious synchronization between the central nervous system and the GIT.
Okay, basically, actually, it is to do with the stress response that occurs between the hypothalamo, pituitary, adrenal axis. Find it all comes to the stress and steroids.
Okay.
Basically, okay? It is the hypothalamo, pituitary, adrenal axis. That stress response that comes, that is why you have the psychological anxiety, stress and all playing a role. Okay, that along with the sympathetic nervous system. That is the reason you have the gut-brain hypothesis being postulated as the #1 theory. Okay. And the second theory is the post-infectious variety, which is almost similar to your SIBO, that is a small intestinal bacterial overgrowth. Generally, the SIBO variety of IBS is more the diarrheal variety, because you see most of these infectious varieties are present with diarrhea only rather than constipation. And there seems to be an autoimmune component to this post-infectious IBS. That is, to this, suppose there is an acute gastroenteritis and there is a toxin produced. The antibodies to this toxin can cross-react to certain mucosal epithelial cell-bearing parts like this vinculum. Now that can cause irritation and that can lead to the intestinal motility. And you know, anything to do with mucosa, vitamin D plays a role. So again, vitamin D deficiency, that is also associated with it. Then you have also genetical aspect. People who have the SCN5A mutation, they tend to have the IBS of the constipation variety. Okay, the constipation type is common in that. And you said abdominal pain. Yes, doctor, abdominal pain is the key symptom. But another thing that the patient most importantly will tell, which is mentioned in many textbooks, is tenesmus. The pain is associated with tenesmus. So each time they have the urge to pass the stool, but they don't actually pass the stool, or they don't have the satisfaction of emptying the bowel. So tenesmus is an important component of that abdominal pain for IBS. Okay?
Okay.
Okay, doctor. And as you said, among the dietary aspects, you have to increase the fiber. Yes, FODMAPs. That is FODMAPs is your fermented oligosaccharide, disaccharide, monosaccharide, and polyols. They
Okay.
play a role. They are supposed to play a role. But most importantly, they say any food substance that causes gas formation, legumes, beans, cabbage, lettuce, broccoli, all this to be avoided in those people who are prone for IBS. And of course, one important antibiotic which plays a role in IBS is, what is the best antibiotic for IBS of the diarrheal variety, which is similar to your SIBO? You have yourself mentioned, Dr. Govind, it is rifaximin.
Rifaximin.
Yeah, that is it. Okay. So, very good presentation by you, Dr. Govind. I request the other members of the faculty to join in and contribute. Any of the faculty kindly contribute to the discussion. Another one point to note, doctor, generally, patients, nowadays, we tend to add proton pump inhibitors to almost every prescription. People who have IBS, this proton pump inhibitor, especially if it comes with a combination of, the prokinetics, it can worsen the IBS of the diarrheal variety. So we should avoid the proton pump inhibitors with the prokinetics in the IBS of the diarrheal variety.
Okay.
And invariably, since IBS is associated with a certain amount of anxiety, stress, many of these patients have the chronic fatigue syndrome symptoms. Fibromyalgia, chronic fatigue syndrome, associated GERD, all this is common in these patients. And that is why in the treatment, we add all these antidepressants like tricyclic antidepressants or your SSRIs, whatever. Okay?
Okay.
Yes, doctor?
Ma'am,
Yes, doctor, if can we wind up? Requesting other faculties, can we wind up? It's not yet 3:30, but anybody would like to add on, or shall we wind up? Okay, doctor, if there is no further discussion to be added on, I think maybe we can wind up this schedule. Probably we're winding up 10 minutes ahead of schedule. But thank you very much, Dr. Sri Balaji and Dr. Govind, for your good presentation on irritable bowel syndrome at short notice too. Thank you, doctors.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you.